Hey, I think we're live on Facebook.
We're good to go. Okay, welcome to Book Sandwich In. Today we have Dr. Ravi Shankar, a poet and recently a memoirist, also recently a PhD recipient from the University of Sydney, to talk about his new book, Correctional, which will be out from the University of Wisconsin Press in January 2022. Dr. Shankar is a Pushcart Prize-winning poet, translator, and professor who has published 15 books, including the Muse India award-winning translations Andal, the Autobiography of a Goddess, and The Many Uses of Mint, New and Selected Poems, 1997 to 2017. Along with Tina Chang and Nathalie Handal, he co-edited W. Norton's Language for a New Century, Contemporary Poetry from the Middle East, Asia, and Beyond, called A Beautiful Achievement for World Literature by Nobel Laureate Nadine Gordimer. He has taught and performed around the world and appeared in print, radio, and TV in such venues as the New York Times, NPR, BBC, and the PBS Newshour. He has won awards to the Corporation of Yaddo and the MacDowell Colony, fellowships from the Rhode Island and Connecticut Council on the Arts, founded one of the oldest electronic journals of the arts, Drunken Boat, is a chairman of the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators, APWT, and recently finished his PhD from the University of Sydney. Again, Correctional is forthcoming in 2022 with University of Wisconsin Press. So we're so happy to have you here, Professor, and we're so excited for this conversation. Like I said in an email, the book is very readable, and runs the whole gamut of like emotional responses. So I'm really excited to get into that as well. But to both to kind of introduce your voice as a poet and your kind of like the breadth of your work, I'm going to begin with a poem that is from Professor Shankar's collection, Deepening Groove. The poem is called Double Rainbow, and the book was published in 2011. Double Rainbow. Speeding without destination, after dark torrents have poured and been returned at home, the skies above mirror my mood. Windshield wipers knifing through sheets, back roads slick with pooling, when a shard of cloudlessness opens. Pulling over, cutting the ignition, I unstitch myself from the humid seat, still fuming, to greet a full spectrum of color arcing past the treetops in lockstep with its fainter inverse. Archer's bow, hem of the sun god's coat, bridge between worlds, reconciliation and pardon. They don't last. And the movement that's so arresting in this poem is the attention and the aliveness to what surrounds us, and of course that kind of heavy conclusion that the poem reaches, which is that reconciliation and pardon, they don't last. So I wonder if you could, I don't know where this poem sits in your biography, like, where, at which point in life you were reflecting on these questions, but I'm just wondering how you think about reconciliation and pardon now in terms of your rich and varied life experience, and maybe how the poem enters that conversation with yourself.
Great. What a great question. And I had never thought of that before. And first, I'd like to thank you, Toby, and New Haven Free Public Library for hosting me. I lived in Connecticut for a long time. I still have a lot of dear friends in Connecticut, and much of the book, and I just received the hard copy. So now I know for sure that the supply chain has not totally prevented it from being published. It's on its way. But much of the book also takes place in Connecticut. And so this is my first Connecticut event. And so I'm very grateful to be with you. And until you made that connection, I hadn't really thought about it. That poem comes from a book of a series of poems I called Pastorals, and they're all in the same form, these 4 little tercets, and they're all about kind of awareness, attention to, and engagement with the natural world in some way. But certainly I think this book, Correctional, is all about these ideas of reconciliation and pardon, and about us as an American society, if we are able to forgive. And I think just since we're talking about this, and of course, Bell Hooks just passed away, and one of her quotes really resonates with me that I'll share with you. For me, forgiveness and compassion are always linked. How do we hold people accountable for wrongdoing and yet at the same time remain in touch with their humanity enough to believe in their capacity to be transformed? And I really think the wisdom of that is at the core of the story that I wanted to tell. It is in some ways a way of me forgiving both myself and also looking closely at the society that we have that doesn't seem to be that forgiving, and kind of shedding light on that through my own personal experiences with immigration, the criminal justice system, mass media, all of those different elements.
Thank you. Yeah. I wanted to just quickly flag the question you asked is really interesting to me, that, you know, we have, in some sense, the work of learning to forgive others while believing they can change is also the work of learning to forgive ourselves, or, you know, confronting what seems like, what seems impossible to change in ourselves as well. And I think the harder question that also opens up from out of that for me is like, how do we then address or confront these social and structural issues that, or these places that seem hard, that seem slow to forgive or seem uninterested in forgiveness? And is there a kind of forgiveness that we can extend toward the system? And I don't know that I don't know if I can go there, but I'm interested in that question. I hope we can come back to it as well. The framing of the book is really helpful, I think. And early in the book, you describe your aims and your intentions, much in a similar way to the way you just described. But it's a brief quote, and it starts, "This is me seen through 6 seasons, each one taking the form of a letter to a loved one. And this memoir is a trace of what the worst years of my life ended up teaching me about the American criminal justice system and mental illness at the beginning of the 21st century. This is how I learned to process a generation's worth of racism, sexism, shame, and redemption, while at the same time coming to grips with the dark inner mechanisms of my own heart. This is the song to set all that straight. Not a confessional, a correctional." And of course, on the one hand, there's the strong literary history of the confessional, both on the religious aspect, from St. Augustine to even like the Confessions of Nat Turner in American Letters. And people who enjoy poetry will also make that connection to the confessional poets of the mid 20th century, some of which include Robert Lowell and Sylvia Plath, for example. And in many of these literary contexts, what you're getting in the confessional is an expectation of somehow not like wrongdoing, but somehow an expectation of needing to be pardoned and needing to be absolved of something. And I think one question that I have is in the way you turn away from the confessional, what kinds of assumptions are you hoping to turn away from? And on the other hand, how does the correctional work for you, and how does the correctional relate to that that beautiful rhyme between, you know, the correctional facility and somehow the correctional record, or correcting of the record?
Yeah, that's a really deep question, and I certainly had in mind. I like you kind of grew up. Some of my first poets I encountered were Anne Sexton and Lowell and W.D. Snodgrass, and this idea that confessional poetry would take what was kind of repressed and projected outwards through verse. It's very intimate, but it's also narrowly self-oriented, I think, and that was one of the moves that I wanted to turn away from. You know, I think I call this book a correctional, and as coming to this, and we can talk a little bit about what it's like being a poet writing in this longer form. It took me a long time to kind of master some of the intricacies of it, and as a poet, I love polyvalence and words that have multiple connotations. And so correctional for me, as you mentioned, literally it deals with Hartford Correctional Center, where I spent 90 days of pretrial detention in the midst of this very successful life when I was in fact being promoted to full professor. That's the literal level, but then there is a more internal way in which this is a correctional of me grappling with how I could have emerged in this place, and also how I could kind of redress my own wrongs with people that I cared about. And that's why I have these 6 letters that are a little bit of the architectural spine. But I think more holistically, thinking about the larger criminal justice system, and how we could really correct it, because my experience with it was that it's deeply and fundamentally broken. And going through what I did, it made me kind of do research on the history of mass incarceration, the moment of its racialization. And of course, a lot of this, I mean, when you brought up this idea of trying to forgive the institution, which I think is such a profound notion, were it to be possible. And I think if we were to try to gesture in that direction, we first have to look at the historical roots, because so much of our legal code is still steeped in what the Puritans brought over. Initially there was what was called the bloody codes in England, whereby a lot of the punishment was done in public. And there were dunkings and pilloryings and, remember the Scarlet Letter. There was a way in which you were publicly shamed. And the Quakers, who were the left wing of their time, really believed that imprisonment was a more humane alternative to these very kind of medieval practices. And they believed in 2 principles we still find in incarceration today: labor and silence. And so you see solitary confinement, and you see the ways in which prison labor is still used, and there's profit made on that. But I argue, and my contention is that this puritanical notion of shaming never really goes away. It just kind of gets pushed down into this subterranean space. And that, in fact, once someone has served their time, pay their debt to society, they should be able to reintegrate. But everywhere along the way, I found that the mechanisms were dysregulative, that they worked against rehabilitation, and that, in fact, the stigma of even having a misdemeanor conviction made it very difficult for many of these men and women that I spoke to really move forward with their lives. And so it got me really thinking about the amount of money that we spend for the system that really is significantly broken, has racially disparate outcomes for its citizens, and whether, in fact, we can collectively correct it. And so I hope that this book is not just a literary artifact, but something to spur us into some kind of dialogue and some kind of action with correcting the society that we live in.
This reminds me, I'm sorry. I feel like a good non-spoilery preface to the book would be to say, this is about Professor Shankar's experience with two run-ins with, I guess, the detention, the correctional system in America, one of which was in the wake of a wrongful arrest, and the second of which was in the wake of a conviction in the eyes of the law. And so to continue with your discussion, I think maybe one way to ask the question is maybe how did the personal nature of these run-ins spur your desire to do more research and to engage with the histories, both like long American history and the histories of mass incarceration that are so well researched and so well presented in the book.
Yeah, and maybe this, I realize I didn't quite finish answering this question about the confession, because, the other thing about a confession, of course, is that it is a kind of a spiritual conversation, right? In fact, confessions is certain religiously authorized speech in Catholicism, for example. But I really think of the confession as kind of getting real with oneself in some way. And I think that the book attempts to do that. And what I realized is that I had a lot of expectations of what it would be like. I've read the literature, I've read Michelle Alexander's A New Jim Crow, and I knew theoretically what it was like. But then when I experienced all of this firsthand, it really just opened my eyes, and I can't unsee what I have seen now. And I met these men, and first of all, I wasn't in a cell. I was at Hartford Correctional Center. You're in New Haven now. This is in Hartford, and it's kind of a pre-trial detention facility where a lot of people are waiting for trial. I met people who had a cash bond on them that they couldn't meet, and they had been literally sitting there for months waiting, and their case would just be continued. And I was in a dorm with 60 other men, and there was very little schooling or instruction or possibility of rehabilitation. And so most of the time was spent just telling stories, playing cards, passing the time. And so I got to know these men. And I think that sometimes we tend to stigmatize those we don't know, or under the rhetoric of law and order or public safety, we demonize those who we think we have broken the law. But my conversations with many of these men, some of them might have had substance abuse issues or mental health problems, but they certainly didn't belong in jail. These problems weren't being addressed in jail. And then others really had been kind of, by virtue of being a person of color in America, stigmatized a priori as criminal in some way. And so, I met someone who got arrested smoking a joint, and then had a criminal record, and had to drop out of school, was going to night school for accounting, and then had these, once you're in the system, it's very hard to get out. I mean, probation, parole, these are all kind of working against you. I mean, really, I think this is part of the reason why the rates of recidivism in the US are so much higher than any other industrialized nation. So he had missed the birth of his first child, and the kind of generational damage that this does was really unspeakable. And so I think part of the reason I wrote this book is I made a promise to some of these men that I would tell their stories. And they told me, and of course, my story is a little different because I'm someone who's benefited immensely from the systems of privilege that exist. I mean, I come from a solidly middle class. My parents were immigrated from South India, but my father was a mechanical engineer. I was educated at all the best institutions. And so the systems of privilege that exist in this country have benefited me immensely. And yet, at the same time, I had experienced some of the similar discrimination that some of these men had experienced. And as one of them put it to me, he's like, your skin darker than a grocery bag, man, you're one of us. This is America. And so it was that sense. They told me I had to, and the other interesting thing is not a spoiler either, but these 90 days I had to do was spread out over about a year and a half. And so, which in retrospect, I wished that I had done it all in one go, because every single time you have to be processed and turned into a carceral object again, it's humiliating and difficult and traumatic for sure. But that first 45 days I did, I really kind of got to know some of the men, and I describe them in the book. And they said, you have a voice out there. We don't have a voice, and we're sharing with you these stories, and we want you to do something with them. Tell people about our lives, what we have experienced in here. And I said I would. And that was really the moment that I knew I'm a writer anyway, and I needed to do something with this material to survive. But when I had those conversations with those men, and I realized that they kind of had accepted me as part of this makeshift family for a brief period of time, and shared things with me that were deeply personal. And I had a kind of moral obligation to do something with those stories.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. And that's also one of the themes that I encountered in the book is this the ability to reverse what feels like the worst aspects of the experience. So one of the worst aspects of the experience for you is the publicity of it. Like, you're this professor, and every time you are reprocessed or go back into jail, or into the detention center, somebody had like, there's like a news article or somebody's like, right, or some politician is trying to capitalize on the act. And in a sense, you recognize that you were wishing for a quiet, less dramatic version of the experience, but you also recognize that a lot of the inmates that you're in conversations with and you're around are experiencing this kind of forgetting and this kind of erasure, that they don't actually get to have their stories told or cared about. And I think that's, I mean, one of the lessons that I kept coming back to in correctional is just the way that sometimes what we take as our curses, or our, at the very least our banes, can actually end up being, what creates the potential, or the potential energy for like changes that we can make.
Yeah, I mentioned in near the end of the book this Japanese concept of wabi sabi, which kind of speaks to it, which is, if you know anything about Japanese ceramics, usually if you fire a pot in a kiln and it cracks, you get really upset because it's broken. But in Japanese culture, they'll inlay those cracks with gold and call attention to it, and it becomes kind of rarer than the perfectly symmetrical design. And I just love that idea that the scar becomes the source of the beauty in some way. And that was certainly my experience, that this really humiliating time. And, I was convicted of a misdemeanor, and yet the Hartford Courant, I think, wrote 7 or 8 different articles about me. They sent news cameras to my house where my elementary school daughter was waiting for a school bus. And, subsequently I found out it's really interesting what is covered and what is not covered. I was one of the few faculty member of color at Central, and I know poet and professor promoted while in prison has a kind of sexy alliterative appeal. But I found that there was very little room for nuance or complexity in these stories. And I guess that's the other reason for this correctional. It's like, okay, well, I want to tell you what really happened. And what these journalists are distilling is really kind of sensationalized, as you alluded to. Some of these columnists were trying to take shots at the Board of Regents, who were appointed by the Democratic governor at the time, and who were the ones who rubber stamped my promotion. And that moment, there is this moment where I'm being promoted to full professor, and on the outside, I'm being excoriated and humiliated. I mean, some dear friends of mine have backed away, and I am in ostrich oblivion, utterly shamed. And yet this news comes on the television when I'm on the inside, and all of a sudden, in Hartford Correctional, I've become this enormous folk hero. Everyone is like slapping me fives, and they want to give me food, and they are asking me to help them write letters and give them legal advice and relationship counseling, and the COs are talking to me and wanting to find out about college. And it was just such an odd whiplash, knowing that on the outside there's this one thing happening, on the inside there's this other thing happening. And really, I'm neither of these things. My identity is being kind of manipulated on both sides in some way.
Yes, and I understand. I know that we're definitely balancing like the research and the good, like the work element of the book with the personal side. So I don't want to over focus on the personal side or doing that, but I'm very interested in it, of course. I think one of the other questions that really that you just kind of distilled is this question of, like, I think, deciding on your own self-perception, or like, even with the way, with the differences between like how you're perceived on the outside and how you're perceived on the inside, like ultimately trying to find your own sense of yourself, and the self that you can be comfortable with, and the self that you can bring into the world to actually enact the kinds of changes that you want to see. Yeah, so I guess maybe
the other layer, of course, is that I talk about being South Asian, and certainly my parents were quite kind of stern and orthodox, and what I went through is really the ultimate humiliation for them. They can't, in fact, my mother still couldn't really understand why I felt compelled to write this memoir, because the typical South Asian response to anything traumatic is to dig a hole very deep and shovel it down and put more dirt on until you never really talk about it again. But it felt necessary on a lot of levels to kind of tell their story and kind of reckon with my own story in light of this experience, which I think ends up becoming more of a kind of an American story, really. I mean, I feel like I learned so much about the country that I live in. You know, I wrote this little essay in the Marshall Project. Nothing has made me feel more American than going to jail. And I feel like that's true because this is the shadow of the country that we live in. It's the truth that really should have us protesting in the streets, that we are the land of the free, home of the brave, and yet 25% of the world's prisoners, we represent 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners are here. And when you overlay it with the racial demographic of who is imprisoned and for what reasons and for what length of time, it becomes a really disturbing picture indeed.
Yeah, and obviously the publicity that you've done to like make these to put these statistics in the world and also to give them a face and a name and like a story is it's incredibly important in itself. But I also wonder, are there spaces or places that you've been able to address these questions of mass incarceration in the non-literary world?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that I really wanted to do after going through this, I got this fellowship at the University of Sydney, was really connect with people who are actively engaged in criminal justice reform in some way. And that's kind of why I connected with the Marshall Project. I'm also a member of this terrific theatrical group, And Still We Rise, which is comprised of people who have been affected by the criminal justice system. And we all write our own stories, act them out. And I have been having conversations. The interesting thing about this book is it is both in the realm of criminal justice, but also Asian studies and also literary history and memoir. And so I've been trying to, I'm donating a portion of the proceeds of this book to Garden Time, which is a Rhode Island-based nonprofit organization that brings gardening skills and knowledge of food and horticulture and cooking to incarcerated men and women in Rhode Island. And so I did a writing workshop for them, and actually talking to people who are engaged in the practice of trying to dismantle what is really oppressive and unfair has really given me a sense of hope. I think I felt quite hopeless when I came out of this experience, and I still didn't know how I would rebuild my own life, let alone help a lot of the people that I'm in the process also of helping with the CVs and the reintegration of some people who have been incarcerated. And I just talked to someone, Donnell, about this, and he said, the reintegration services, we should be lucky if we can get a job flipping burgers or working at Dunkin' Donuts or doing retail. And he said, before I was incarcerated, I'm a musician, I'm a father, I have a degree from a community college. And now when I get out, they're telling me, this is all I'm capable of. This is the only thing that I can do. And so, I really believe that this phrase, intentional inclusion, which is bandied about a lot. And I think that we really need to bring that to bear to help, especially when we know that the system is unfair, inequitable, and is actually built to actually trigger traumatic response in some way, that whatever we can do to try to help undo some of those wrongs, I think I find to this day really part of my life's work and mission.
Wow, that's beautiful. And I mean, you're a busy man. Like you got a lot going on, and I'm glad I asked that, because I think I wasn't actually aware of the ways that your work has continued after incarceration to like continue helping people reintegrate in society and also help them in while they're in prison as well. I know you were involved in also prison teaching as well, right? The LEAP program.
Yes, and I actually also there not far from New Haven. Actually, I taught a few writing workshops at the York Correctional Center, which is a women's prison in Niantic. And there actually is a great book. Wally Lamb, the Connecticut writer, did an anthology with some of these women. And that was one of the most moving, the last class I was in tears, the women were in tears. I mean, it was like the amount of intense interest, energy, and gratitude they had for anyone kind of coming in and taking, and they were really talented, and they made themselves vulnerable to me. And I'm a big believer in bibliotherapy. I believe giving people the tools to tell their own story, to understand their own experience, really helps healing in a big, big way. And so, and that the sad thing is, at Hartford Correctional, the library had been like stripped out. There used to be apparently writing classes, and those had been taken out. And these are all the very elements that I think would help people to reintegrate in a more healthy fashion. And yet, collectively, there's this idea that, we need to punish these men and women. Well, taking them away from their families and from society seems punishment enough. I mean, to add another layer of traumatic experience onto them, it just makes me question if that's what we want to do as a society, and if it in fact is productive. And I would argue that no, it is not.
I would agree that it's counterproductive. And I mean, there's also a scene actually where you discuss the redactions that come with like the library, like where people waiting for books that like somebody has to decide whether it's appropriate to be read by inmates, or or takes out these 4 pages and these 4 sentences in order. It's like you said, it's both counterproductive and like it's draconian in a way that seems designed to harm, as opposed to like designed to rehabilitate. And yeah, I mean, those questions about the criminal justice system do come up often. I think it's really helpful to have someone's experience who has experienced it and can illuminate it and can use the stories to question it, that we sometimes maybe on the outside get desensitized to, or desensitized to numbers, or desensitized to statistics. So yeah, thank you again for being involved in this way and invested. Well, I think we have a listener question in the chat, so I'll ask that question, and then I think you have a selection you wanted to read as well from, right?
Oh yes, I can.
Yeah, so this is from Zara. I appreciate the reminder that the scars become the source of beauty if we allow the space for the scars to transform us. I'm interested in the conversation begun about finding pathways to forgiving the institutions of oppression, how that may look, and what that might mean for both us and the institutions. Thank you very much for this conversation. Yeah, so that's again the hard question that I wonder about. And I think for me, as an immigrant, a fellow immigrant, also actually a fellow Northern Virginian, which is very funny. But a fellow immigrant and a fellow experience, someone who's experienced different intensities of America's racial past. I think somehow, for me, accepting my own self and accepting an image of myself that isn't tainted by those experiences has involved a degree of forgiveness, or a degree of like being willing to not let a grudge against the system dictate my behavior or dictate how I enter the world, right? And I mean, the wounds are of different magnitudes, but I think any degree of like self-acceptance or self-recognition has involved being able to relinquish what being harmed feels like it says about you, or being harmed feels like it turns you into. And so that's my approach to the question. And I'm not sure how I think it's again a very personal scale, and it's a scale that can't quite address like how much and how great the harm of the institution can be.
Maybe for me, I would say it's also trying to have compassion for and forgiving the people who represent the institutions, and that knowing that there's something actually intrinsic in the ways these institutions were built. I mean, when the police force came out of slave patrols, and when the two great moments of explosion in the prison population was right in the post-Reconstructionist South, when there's a kind of a plantation to prison pipeline, and then right at the end of the civil rights movement in the 1970s, that was in fact exacerbated by our supposedly liberal president, Bill Clinton, with his omnibus crime bill and mandatory minimums and super predators and all of that. And so, I have met people who are decent individuals, and yet they're still complicit in a system that creates a lot of harm. And so I think being able to forgive those people and then engage with them in the dialogue of what small role they play in keeping this system active might be one way of thinking about it. But maybe I'll just read you, this actually talks about a little of this. I'll read you one of the letters from the book, and this is the final letter, and it encompasses some of what we've been discussing about spirituality and confession. And I'll just say that there's 6 letters in the book. There kind of begins with a letter, ends with a letter, and each letter is named after one of the 6 seasons in South India. And so in addition to the 4 seasons we have here, there are 2 additional seasons: the monsoon, which is the season of heavy rain, and the pre-vernal, which kind of comes before springtime. And this one is that final season, Pinpunny, pre-vernal, and it has a little epigraph from Emily Dickinson. "This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me. Dear creation, I jacked up my life because I once saw God. Up on a mountaintop with one of my best friends as a witness, I felt the ripple of energy that keeps us connected, harmonizing with my own intent and possible futures. There were deer involved in a thunderstorm, but it's a revelation that will only feel mundane, even in deployment of the most refined language. It's simply enough that it happened. I was provided that afternoon, a destiny to which I failed to measure up, given a family I could have kept intact if not for my personal menagerie of pig, cock, and snake. That's what I find hardest to forgive myself for, since I'll never know what was down that other diverging road. Instead, I took the one less traveled by, the more painful, self-revealing path, and that has made all the difference. Robert Frost continues to be my American freshman college students' favorite poet, which always astonishes me because they don't seem to exhibit much in common with his bleak, overdetermined stoicism. I'm always glad to introduce these students to other poets and writers, running the gamut from Etheridge Knight and Claudia Rankin to Emily Dickinson and John Keats, whose advice to tell all the truth but tell it slant, or whose concept of negative capability, being in uncertainty, mystery, doubt, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason, remains so germane. The world is never quite so monochromatic as we might hope, and the divisions between us are just in our minds. None of us are born wanting to marginalize another human being, yet when in history an entire economy is fabricated upon the enslavement of others, and that some people continue to benefit disproportionately from that fact, we need to point it out, even if it makes us uncomfortable. When we see the outdated puritanical mechanism of shaming being used, we need to respond with compassion. For Buddhists, shame, if understood properly for what it is, an impoverished mentality, the terror of being judged, a state of lacking, the condition of perpetual insufficiency, can actually become a transformative principle. It can provide a gateway to a larger, more inclusive sense of belonging and help open us up compassionately to others. It shows how empty the egoism with which we invest ourselves really is compared to the vastness of our luminous true natures. In Madras, South India, where my father's family comes from, there's a sing-song taunt that you will hear in the dusty schoolyards. Shame, shame, puppy shame, all the monkeys know your name. The chant means to jeer that you've been found out, been exposed bare ass as a newly born cur. The fact that one of the slang connotations of the word puppy in Tamil is penis only adds delectably to the cutting double entendre. This is a kind of phrase my bow-tied adversaries would intone in unison at my convent school when one of the younger students had peed himself in fright after being set upon by bullies wielding tiffin carriers. That nursery rhyme chorus is a way of othering, of making a distinction between a group and an individual, of drawing a line in the sand of saying, you're there, and I'm here with the others. You live on the other side of the border from us. Isn't that what it means when a group or individual is cast beyond the pale? That linguistic phrase for impropriety absorbs connotations as it moves through time. Etymologically, the idiom refers to an archaic definition of that word pale, that is a region lying within an imposed boundary, like a staked fence as part of what Ireland was for 14th century English administrators, so that going beyond it was doing something outside those lines. It began to mean acting bizarrely or slightly abhorrently, literally leaving civilization behind. And yet now when we hear that phrase, we can't help but see color. Pale face, as in possessing a white complexion, as in conforming and being civilized. Overlay that sense with the act of colonizing a territory or policing the grounds of propriety, and we have a very different signification indeed. Today, it's the prison population who are beyond the pale. Personally, though, I've always been more interested in the shadow, that part of ourselves that we're ashamed of and that we feel guilty about, the part that has the propensity to grow if ignored. The shadow is dangerous, primitive, irrational, reeks of the public lavatory, the taboo. If collectively we don't pay it the attention it deserves, it could swallow up an entire epoch. This is the place where shame might be productively used. Carl Jung has written that shame is a soul-eating emotion. And it is that for sure. But in its corrosive capacity, it can completely hollow us out so that in the empty space cleared out, we have greater capacity for empathy towards those around us. Connecting with the part of ourselves we hope others don't see is to begin to dissolve the very mindset that harbors that hope in the first place. In the process of learning to forgive ourselves, we can also forgive others. Here I stand, your Keatsian example of negative capability. I've been a professor and a prisoner, a thief and a saint, a citizen and an anarchist, mentally gifted and mentally ill. Consciously and inadvertently, I've inflicted harm on other living creatures, and I've sacrificed myself completely for their well-being many times over. I've been your mother and you've been my daughter for so many lifetimes, all of us spinning together on this marvelous planet, orbiting a star in an unfathomable universe of stars. Let's actively, not abstractly, love each other and work to change this world we share to be more magnanimous. For in such daily acts of connectedness, grace resounds more permanently than the sound of a judge's gavel against a wooden bench. It's a reverberation to ripple us awake.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that beautiful reading. Yeah, just again, to express gratitude for your work in, dissolving those boundaries between the selves that we want to hide and the selves that we know we can be. It was incredibly great personal reading for me, and I think it also makes a lot of openings and possibilities for people to really start to imagine the kinds of kinship with those that we, for various reasons, want to, not want to, or for various reasons, imagine as outside of our purview of society or outside of our purview of the pale. So yeah, I wanted to flag the projects that we discussed earlier that you have going on, in addition to obviously Correctional, which everybody should pick up a copy of once it's out in January. We have, you also mentioned being the chairman of Asia Pacific Writers and Translators, and there's a reading series called ISO Break.
Oh, yes. This is a great organization. In fact, you don't have to be living in Asia Pacific, just interested in the region to become a member. Kind of like AWP in the US, but it's an international organization. And there is a monthly reading series called Isolation Break, ISO Break for short. And it's been happening over the last 2 years. I'm the MC and I curate it. And we always have 5 readers from usually 3 or 4, sometimes 5 different countries around the world. So, finding the right time that works for everyone's a little bit of a challenge, but it's been a really rich way, especially during the pandemic when everyone's felt so isolated and so alone, a way of kind of connecting outward with a community that exists again beyond our borders, and to discover new kinds of writing that are happening in Asia and Australia and beyond. So yeah, definitely check that out for sure. ISO Break, and the organization is APWT, Asia Pacific Writers and Translators.
I actually have a hand up in the chat. Rebecca Hawk, H-A-Q-U-E, Rebecca. Are we able to turn her microphone on?
Sure. Oh, Rebecca, hello.
I think your microphone is still off, Rebecca, in case you're talking. I mean, yeah, you can also answer your question in the chat if your microphone is not turning on. We can read your question from the chat in that case. We also have a question from Seth, our reference librarian in New Haven's Free Public Library. Dr. Shankar, as a great son of Tamil Nadu, can you comment on the great Tamil poet Kalki Krishnamurthy, and has this had any influence on your writings?
I do know Kalki. Actually, my grandfather, who was a journalist who worked for the Hindu, which is the largest English language newspaper in India, actually knew Ramaswamy Krishnamurthy, also known as Kalki. That pen name is the final avatar of Vishnu, is Kalki, the white horse. And so I growing up was exposed a little bit to him. He's one of these amazing journalists who also wrote short stories, novellas, historical romances, music reviews, and the like. And he also is a Tamilian Brahmin, so we kind of share that caste a little bit. My mother tongue is Tamil, which is a language, sometimes people don't realize that India there are 22 official languages in the Indian constitution, not including Hindi, which is the national language, and English, which is the lingua franca. And so Tamil, as I like to say, there are more native Tamil speakers in India than there are native English speakers in America, just to give you a sense of the reach and breadth of that language. And it's a beautiful language. So I've translated the 8th century Tamil poet mystic Andal with Indian poet Priya Sarukai Chabria, and we published a book of her translations. And so delving back into my Tamil roots is something I'm looking forward to doing even more, for sure.
Yeah, that's really cool. Thank you. I'm glad Seth asked that question. Rebecca might have a question in the chat, but I guess the last thing I was going to ask was the title of the anthology of women poets, which you mentioned your co-editor, but I just remember the title. I want to flag the title as well in the chat. Oh,
it's called Autobiography of a Goddess.
Cool, thank you.
And she is one of these amazing figures who not a lot is known about. She's the only female Vaishnavite saint, and apparently composed all of these works, these 2 long poems that are still recited in India today, before the age of about 14 or 15, at which point she apocryphally disappeared. No one knows what happened to her. But her poems are really amazing in that they're really sensual poems, and yet the thing that she longs for is the divine, and it's not anything corporal at all, but she uses the most kind of sensual erotic language to describe this unification with the divine. Her name is Andal. Definitely worth checking out.
That's like a pre-modern Anne Sexton almost. But I believe that's been it's been a lovely talk, and it's been really wonderful to connect your voice to the musings and the reflections of Correctional. Thanks so much again for coming, and hopefully we'll remain in touch and keep hearing you read poems at monthly isolation break as well.
That would be great. And Rebecca is asking something.
Oh.
You can follow me on the socials at Impurpler. The other thing I was just going to mention, actually, Rebecca, who's commenting, was on this trip. We had an immersive writing workshop in Sardinia pre-pandemic. The New York Writers Workshop is hosting another writing workshop in Athens, Greece in May with the poet Kim Adenizio, A.E. Stallings, the translator. And so hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll be able to move again. And if so, yeah, it'd definitely be great to have anyone along. Toby, thanks so much. Really great. And this conversation actually has me thinking about some subconscious connections between some of my poems and the memoir, which I hadn't really thought about. So thank you for that.
My pleasure. Yeah, I love when I read a poem that I've written in the past, and all of a sudden my like present world seems differently illuminated. So I'm glad to offer that possibility as well. But yeah, thank you so much, and thank you, Rebecca, for saying hi, and thank you, Zara, as well, for saying hi.
I think Rebecca is saying hi from Bangladesh. So pretty
wow, cool. Different. That's a lot of time zones away. That's cool. Thank you so much for joining, everybody, and yeah.
Thank you all. Stay safe. You can pick up Correctional and fight the power. Keep faith alive, everyone.
Yes, let's end mass incarceration, or have faith in it, at least.
Yeah.